And I often say to feeling-based people and helping them understand this function is you need to doggedly say, I have no clue. It just feels wrong. I just know that it is wrong. I was visiting with a therapist yesterday, actually, about how she is going to present her case in a courtroom. Now, a courtroom, this probably will enlighten all of you, is not really feeling friendly, by and large. And so Caitlin is going to say, well, I just feel this kid has not been molested by his father. That's not good enough, because the antagonistic attorney, who, by the way, is also feeling based, is not going to go there. And she is going to challenge Caitlin with that. So my belief about this feeling function is dreadfully important, especially in this country, that it has become emotionalized, where feeling-based people are not predominantly emotional. They are, I would aver, more emotionally aware. They may be more emotionally expressive. But I am a thinking-based person. There's not a day goes by I don't cry. Not a day. There's very seldom that I don't come to tears in and around the therapy I do with people. Far more than most of the feeling-based people that I know. I am just aware of that. Now, when it comes to other matters that are interpersonal, that may play a very different role in my life because I'm a thinking-based person. But aside from that, I've probably gone on more than is valuable, typical to my extroverted nature. But so that's my thought about that. That again, just to augment that, to be a feeling-based person is not necessarily be emotional. We all have affect. It needs to be respected. Needs to be owned up to.
Good. And New York City, New York, the last one on the go-around. Any questions from New York City?
A friend and I, who I'm here with the seminar, we were talking, and we were sort of saying that sometimes it's hard to tell what kind of types we are because our functions almost seem somewhat like tendrils or roots or dendrites, where in some areas we can be more feeling, and in other areas we can be more thinking, or depending on who we're with, we can be more extroverted or more introverted. Depending on our mood, sort of our reaction to the world and to ourselves can change.
Yeah, thank you. To Chicago, did you hear that?
Yes, we heard that.
Good.
My first response and primary response is, good for you. Good for you. You have probably developed beyond, and maybe the case is you've developed so far beyond your dominant function that now your secondary auxiliary functions, maybe even your inferior function, is or are working to your credit. So I think very often the Myers-Briggs way of differentiating people is a helpful beginning, but not an ending. The issue that I take with the MBTI people predominantly is that it's an ending. All they do is have one word after another defining what an E or an S is. And what you're saying is, with some places, I'm operating like a thinking person, other places like a feeling person. Good for you.
Yeah, I would like to comment on that too. It's a good observation. But in point of fact, there are two possibilities here. Until our one or another of the functions or attitudes has been massively reinforced, okay, or if our endowment is pretty lopsided, we're using all four functions and both attitudes in some way most of the time just to get along. Now, some of those ways are going to be better than others. We need to get across the street safely, so we have to relate to the traffic. There is, in Jung's definition, extroversion. We may not be outgoing about it, okay, but we're certainly taking into account. We have to take into account what suits us and what doesn't suit us. So in Jung's definition, that is introversion, utilizing it. It may not be the most energizing thing for us, but we can do it when we're coming from our basic nature, if you will. But when there's a one-sidedness. The people who've studied a bit of Jung or read a bit of Jung know that that's one of his big words, one-sided, it's lopsided, it's off balance, it's out of kilter. When there is a one-sided development or emphasis, then we can get locked in, or we think we are supposed to. You know, this is what the situation calls for. This other side of me is not permitted. So back to the question, the comment from New York, yes, of course. It's great, it's good. It may be that you've developed more. It may be that you're one of those few fortunate people who hasn't been pushed into a one-sided development. Okay. Steve, other things there, or shall we go on?
I think that's all the sites. Go ahead and move forward then.
What's your pleasure here? What's your...
Well, we could go with this and then follow up on this.
Here, we have a question.
Oops. Another question?
Go ahead. Go ahead, whichever side had a question, go ahead, unmute and ask. Okay, we'll Boris around. Just go ahead and move forward. They can re-enter if they need to.
Okay. Well, since we've been talking quite a bit about Jung's view of things, I'd like to refer you to, I think it's page 17 of the Jung on Psychological Type, just for your reference, and I'll go through this. It's the page is titled "Realization of the Functions," and this is a piece that comes from the Vision seminars from the mid-1930s. So the person in the seminar asks, well, what about, must all the functions be used in order to realize? Which means, you can paraphrase that to give a full accounting or a full response to a situation. So Jung says, yes, some people only have access to one function or two functions, and some people have access to three functions. And then he gives an example. And let's see if I can find where it begins. Yes, doctor.
I think it's later.
Okay. All right, now, certain people, he says, have three functions: intellect, sensation, intuition. Intellect would be actually the thinking function in this case. They must not only see that the thing comes off in reality, must also see what is possibly leading into the future, or what is the possible effect on surrounding conditions will be. It's as if they had to extend the process of elucidation very much further in order to realize the importance of a fact. An example, now here's the example he gives, would be when a doctor thinks that a certain disease must be bubonic plague. Now, he's not satisfied with this fact that is according to all the rules. Now, pause here a moment. All the rules would be the phenomenology of the symptoms, for example, which would be a sensation observation. He's observed with his eyes and whatever else is necessary. And he knows from other experience certain patterns. All right. So he has fitted the observable phenomena into a pattern. That would be, in this case, the thinking function, which would be analogous to the periodic chart of the elements. So he's done that piece of work. But he's not satisfied that that's enough. You know, it looks like that's what it is. The next step, then, he says, he will make a bacterial examination of the case. And only when he actually sees the bacteria will he say indubitably that it is bubonic plague. Now here is exercising the sensation function very rigorously. Let's look at it very closely and see what it is. But he does not satisfy himself with that fact either, for he will then ask himself, what does this mean? In other words, what are the possibilities inherent in this fact? It means terrible danger of contagion. Anybody in the surroundings might already suffer from contagion. Might. They do not yet, so far as he knows. But there's the possibility. that this is the first case of an enormous epidemic. Swine flu, all right? He foresees an epidemic, and nobody could say he has realized the fact of the plague as long as he did not realize the possibility of an epidemic, which is not yet, which might never be, but that's still possible. Now, Jung goes on to say, all that can be a perfectly cold-blooded, inhuman statement. A very interesting case and unique. My father is suffering from plague, and I have verified it. It's quite all right according to the rules. And another remarkable fact is that you may catch it too, because you shook hands with him yesterday, and your wife and your children may have it, which will be exceedingly interesting. One will see people die by the hundreds. So what has been left out here is what Jung would call the feeling function, the human value. What is the human value or the human effect of this? Of course, Jung goes on, people will complain that he's a perfect devil. You see, he talks without feeling, and this is not emotionality. It's not emotionality and affect and getting all riled up. It's bringing in the valuing dimension. And he will be accused of not realizing that what the damn thing means. Sure enough, he doesn't, because he needs feeling for a complete realization. He must have the human value of the thing. So, little anecdotes like this, Jung gives another one in another passage. It's essentially the same kind of thing, where he goes through, in his meaning, sensation, thinking, intuition, and feeling, and gives a whole response, if you will, of a realization of the full significance of whatever the piece of information is that he's considering. And this, of course, then plays into that idea of development over the lifetime, that as we recognize that we are not giving a fully adequate response, we're not fully realizing the significance of something, then we have to do whatever is necessary to improve that area where we're weak. We may be strong in lots of things, but let's say that we don't realize, we can't figure out what the possibilities are. So maybe we'll ask somebody, what's possible here? Oh, I never thought of that. Or we go to somebody who's very good working with the hard data, or the empirical evidence, or the specific details of the situation to help us more fully realize.
Let me objectify what my good friend has subjectively suggested. And at first, I'm just delighted to hear from you, Boris. I'm always intrigued. I only understand about a third of what he says, but it's delightful. It's his inquiry, to say nothing about the depth of what he says. I'm not just blowing smoke at you, that's true. But there, let me put a couple of objective legs on what he's saying. There are two things that are relevant. The Myers-Briggs people do talk about what they call the Z function, which is very similar to what he just said. The Z function is this. We do all four functions in a Z fashion. In other words, if you follow my hand here on the perceptive and then the judging function, on this side would be objective seeing, that's sensing, I see something. Then the second thing I do is I have an assessment of what that is. I think, what does it come from? What's it meaning? And then the third thing is then, what do I think about it? And then, how do I feel about it? So the Z function is first S, then N. Have I gone slow enough for you N people out there? Yeah, Z. Z as in Z. Any Canadians out there? Z, right? So it's the S function, then the N function, then the T function, then the F function. If you can see that, I think that doesn't always work, but predominantly, you see something objectively, we see it subjectively, we evaluate it objectively, we evaluate it subjectively. And our doctor friend here, not this doctor, but the doctor that Dr. Jung makes reference to, did three of those functions. Saw something, and then looked at the meaning, and then made a judgment but left out the feeling function. Now, I would suggest that you look at your dominant function and you will reside in one of those four quadrants predominantly. Ask people like me, just love stuff, and we see stuff and we gather stuff and we write words and we go on and on. And people see something and have 14,000 interpretations of what that might mean. Could be this, maybe this, we could change it. Where did it really come from? Let's ask more questions and reside there. Predominantly thinking people gather information and go right into analysis of it, and predominantly feeling people then reside on, well, how does it affect me? How does it affect us?
Now, we could take this clinically and perhaps even personally. If you'll stop for a moment and ponder, reflect, what is your first response to something new that is surprising? What is your first response to something new that is surprising? Anybody in Chicago want to comment on that? First thought is, ooh, what is this? Okay. Pardon?
Why didn't I think of that?
Why didn't I think of that? Something new. So here we have two different responses already.
Tom?
Are they sure?
Are they sure?
Right, or, who says?
Who says? Okay.
What's in it for me?
What's in it for me? Okay. Let's see, Asheville, does anybody there want to say what your first response to a surprising new situation or phenomenon is?
Go ahead.
That is so cool. That is so exciting.
Did you hear that? That
Yeah.
was so cool. That was so exciting. Said with umph.
What does it mean?
What does it mean? Good.
Anybody else at another site, or those good people at home or in your in the secrecy of your little abode or your office want to send in a response here to this question, the new surprising phenomenon or thing, or at another site?
Why now, and what does it mean?
Okay, well, I think clearly, to me anyway, different psychological starting points, different typological starting points are emerging here. You had a comment.
I think, why don't you take an example? Like, someone fires you. I wouldn't say, ooh, you know what I mean? Can we work it with an example?
All right. Can we work this with an example?
Speaking as a sensing type, recall.
All right. That's all right.
Swine flu.
Swine flu. Swine flu. Okay.
Compared to Katrina, you look how both of those were extremely different.
Yeah.
A lot of information on the swine flu. We don't know exactly what's going on, but we get informed every day and updated nationally. Katrina, 3-4 days later, you found something out. No, seriously, it was just sad to watch what happened in Katrina and encouraging me what's happening in swine flu, but very different types of all the way up and down the line, government-wise.
Tom just said here that his response to his interaction with the current swine flu phenomenon is we have a lot of information compared to the Katrina phenomenon, which we had very little information. Swine flu information is coming out by the hour, and Katrina came by the days or weeks. Right.
maybe my question was far too global, so that it may actually be situational also. Let's take for an example. I lost my job. Okay, it's a current situation. I lost my job. So take that as an example and think about what's our first response to that. What would that be?
Let me suggest a ways of looking at that. If I lost my job, so is my first ideation, what should I do? S, how do I feel? F, what do I think here? T, maybe? What are the possibilities? Am I objectifying that too much for you, brother?
That's a good question. Let's see. The longer the image, faster it travels, clearer. Bigger the image, it'll travel much slower.
My inferior would really
Kick in.
bug the heck out of me. I mean, big time.
Yes.
So I would over-objectify myself for that.
Yes.
Yes,
Yes.
which is pretty much my inferior would get pushed.
Tom says that his inferior, which is your sensing function, I'm assuming then, correct?
Yes.
Would take over and operate, but I'd like to suggest that we have a very sensing country here, for one thing. So, I mean, when you are asking someone what someone does for a profession or life, the question is what? What do you do? That very verb is a sensing verb. What do you do? And so if you lose your job, the question very often would be, what should I do? And I think it's germane to consider, well, maybe for, say, a feeling-based person or for an intuitive, that's the wrong question. It should be, what do I feel? What are the possibilities? Or something else. But that do just comes up and screams at you, and it serves the likes of me, because when I see a problem, I've got 4 solutions, and I choose among them. Very often they're all wrong, So I mean, my modus operandi is ready, shoot, aim. So,
And my modus operandi in a situation like that, very reflexively, is to reach for the yellow pages, go on the internet, look for resources. If something doesn't pan out, I think actually I will call on intuition, look for resources, possibilities, and only secondarily will I say, what does this mean to me? Now, it may be that I'm using this intuitive function and searching for possibilities defensively, so that I will not have to experience the unpleasantness of, oh, I feel awful about this, How am I going to eat? When do I have to start living under a bridge, if one's available? So we could perhaps have various responses, but I do think that it's rather informative, though, to see what is our first response to a situation.
Charlotte has jumped in with a response by email, and their answer to the question was, what does this mean? Or another person saying, let's take a look at this.
Yes, good possibilities. What does this mean? There would be, how does it suit me? How does it suit the situation? Or what are the implications of it? What does this mean can be I think it can be a feeling-based question, or it can be, would you say a question of intuition?
I think so.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Right. Okay, I would ask those of you who have that voluminous piece of information in front of you to go to the page that you should be seeing here. We're going to skip this and come back to that if we have time, and go to this page on transference and countertransference. Somebody tells me it's page 26.
28.
Now, if you might note, we have already been talking about this, but let me fill in the blanks for you. I'll do the best I can to race through this and piss everybody off and get something to talk about.
Thank you.
All right. Or I can go abominably slow. Just going to my inferior function, it doesn't operate very well. But transference, as you know, these 2 pages here are a graduate class or 2, but nevertheless, we might generally say that it is feeling and thoughts the client has about the therapist. The origin of these feelings and thoughts the client has about parental and other figures. And the idea of projection in transference is that these feelings and thoughts are projected on you as therapist. I should add to that briefly, generally without the client's awareness of that, and unfortunately, generally without your awareness of it. Freud said that you should begin to do with the transference phenomenon during the first session, which I think is brilliant. I would dare add to that. I think you should begin to deal with the transference phenomenon when your patient calls you on the phone and says, "Can you meet me at 7:30 in the evening because I have to work till 6:30?" There's already a transference phenomenon operating, and certainly with you because you'd like to get home before 9:30. So countertransference is similar. It is, of course, feelings and thoughts that you have about the client. And the origin is the same. Feelings and thoughts you have about parental and other figures. And the projection is you're projecting on the client. It's extremely important. You cannot avoid these 2 phenomena in therapy. And while there are other operations going on, I think this is a hallmark of doing internal therapy at any rate. You might be able to do a certain amount of cognitive behavioral therapy, but I think with great caution. Dealing with transference means dealing with it right away, which means noticing it right away and then processing it in the midst of therapy. When and how to talk about it and when not to is very important, but just for the moment you need to deal with it, which means recognizing it and then processing it, then dealing with it right away, processing it, and so on. Next page. Negative and positive transference are roughly these. Negative transference are those feelings that I have that are what we generally would consider to be negative. Those of you who did not like me, which it might be the majority, first you should know that there's nothing wrong with not liking me. That's very, very important. There were 1 or 2 people here that were courageous enough to say that. I didn't like you. That doesn't mean there's something wrong with me. That doesn't mean there's something wrong with you. That means there's something very, very right, very important. Something is operating between us, but more with me and with you. You're not projecting on an empty screen. You do see my flaws. And part of the reason you react to them is not because they're my flaws, but because you have something that you bring to the table. Yeah. Thank you. And of course there's negative and positive transference, which is essentially the same thing. Just very briefly then, you know you have transference when, I just turned 65, so permit me this here, you are doing any kind of defending. And by the way, we defend anytime we're challenged. So I'm not saying we shouldn't defend, I'm just saying know that you're defending. That is a transference. I mean, if you were perfectly integrated, you would be able to hear a criticism. And aside from Boris, I don't know anybody who's there. 2, you are asked questions that you can't answer. And you are asked questions that you don't want to answer. Or you aren't asked questions. Or you have a patient who agrees with you. Or you have a patient who disagrees with you. Now, I think I've pretty much covered the gamut of what's possibilities there. I mean, liking, not liking, agreeing, disagreeing. They're all transference phenomena. And not unlike that in the countertransference phenomenon, we have you are let's say you like, I don't have this printed very well, forgive me for that. You like the patient a great deal. Or 2, you think about the patient a great deal. Or 3, you talk about the patient. Or 4, you complain about the patient. Now that's a very good example. Since both my wife and I are psychologists, you know, we have the rare occasion of complaining about patients. I'm sure we're maybe not the only people that do that. It is always countertransference. It is always countertransference. Doesn't mean it's wrong. It just means that what we are doing, we have to somehow or another integrate back into the therapy and out of our library.
I know, the nursing instructor said, if you mix those things up, think of the counter makeup girl.
Yes, we'll get to that bit. 5, you dislike the patient, countertransference. Or 6, you identify with the patient, countertransference. So very simply, at the end, I want to know how to deal with it. You admit to it. If you name it, you can claim it. Secondly, I think quite importantly, you keep this to yourself, especially early in the therapy. You notice it, you recognize it, you keep it to yourself. And ultimately, you use it as a bridge. Now, again, realize that what we've just looked at here is deserves a whole lot more attention. There are people that understand the phenomena better than I do. It is not our primary interest at the present time. But I wonder, before we go further, that if there are comments or questions, let's start here in Chicago about this phenomenon. And maybe a nice way to do it is, can you think of a client/patient that you have seen, liked, didn't like, agreed with, didn't agree with, loved you complained about any of the things that I've roughly gone through there?
I worry about situations where, like, we're having emotional reactions to a client where I want to hear up what's happened for them, or really connect with them. I walk away from those sessions sometimes going, wow, I'm in the right profession. And then I also, a little birdie later says, I'm sure that's not to wrap up. So it's a paradox.
Asheville, did you hear that?
No, not fully. If that can be repeated, it'd be helpful.
Jennifer said that she has wondered about the phenomenon of feeling deeply with clients who prefer clients tearing up, feeling like tearing up, feeling joyful, or perhaps feeling sad on other occasions, and wondering what about that phenomenon.
Yeah, because I think it's affirming that I'm in the right profession, but it's also, I have to be really careful about that, because I have to have boundaries there too. So I worry about that paradox. I worry about that.
Let me first relay an experience that happened to me. I've been in practice 40 years. I think it was 35 years ago. I went to see my therapist and said, I have a problem. I feel like crying with my patients. And my therapist said, one word, cry. So I took that back and actually allowed that to happen and governed it. And within a week or so, I don't see females, I just see males, but at the time it was a female patient of mine. And she told me a story that moved me, and I cried, and she looked at me and she said, why are you crying? And I said, I feel bad. She said, nobody's ever cried for me before. So it was a very, very powerful moment. I have on the other side felt for patients. And what I found myself doing sometimes is crying, and he should have been crying. I was feeling his feeling. So what I have learned to do is, no, I feel like crying, govern it, and wouldn't you know, within about 5 seconds, the person on the other side of the desk, figuratively, cries. So for me, that whole phenomenon speaks of this transference, countertransference. It's not germane exactly to our types matter, but it is in that genre.
Well, I hear you talking about transfers, kind of transfers, but I'm not sure how you're relating this to typology.
We'll get there.
Oh, okay.
Yes. Right.
I think for me, it happens with every client. I mean, it's like there's always something I don't like or dislike in everybody. And many customers, but so I just expect it and try to be as conscious as I can with that. And I feel more comfortable with it. Awareness and the comfort with it. But when I don't feel that way, I really get nervous. And then it's unconscious, or I think it is, and that's why I try to meet with other therapists. So we do that once a month, and take it out. And that's very helpful for me to catch that unconscious. I might be working too much and not paying attention.
Let me just very briefly repeat what Tom says. Tom suffers from a bit of a neurological disorder. It affects his speech a little bit. I'm not trying to override him here, but at any rate, he affirms, I think, what Jennifer just said, that among other things, he has dealt with feeling deeply, and feeling deeply for clients is very important. And he also adds then, when I don't feel deeply, what does that mean? Does I speak adequately for you? So we had a question which we will deal with. How does this relate to the typology, which is really what we want to get to, but I wanted to lay just some brief groundwork. So there in Ashland or elsewhere, are there other comments in regards to this?
Any Asheville questions? Comments? Let's go around Flat Rock. Any questions? Comments?
None here, Steve, thanks.
Okay, good. Thank you. Omaha?
About, and I don't know if this is the time to ask it or not, or because I'm not sure which direction we're going, but here's the question. It's a diagnostic question about, say, hysteria. When, what would be the relationship between something like a hysterical client or hysterical response and typology?
Very relevant question. If we have time, we will look at more specific psychological disorders and their correlates with various parts of typology, which I think we can do. We can make some general statements, but there are some very specific disorders. In that case, when Freud identified the hysteric, now of course called histrionic personality, which I think is unfortunate terminology. I don't like hysteric much either, but at any rate, what she was extroverted feeler, so we might dare say that that tends to be the phenomenon of hysterics, or hysterical reaction is extroverted feeling.
I like the term because I think it describes it perfectly.
Yes, histrionic or
Hysteric.
Hysteric, yes, right. Well, as a recovering hysteric myself, I thought.
New York City? Any questions from New York City? And South Bend, anything from South Bend?
Our group wished to make the comment that it's feeling just a bit scattered at this point, and wondered if, in now or probably in the future, a case study, one particular case looked at in more depth might be a little more practical or useful. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Good. Well, thank you. I'll let Boris and Ron comment that in a little bit. Let me read one question from the internet, which is, please elaborate on the concept of, quote, living the wrong type, unquote, that one hears about in Jungian circles.
Well, yeah, we did talk about living the wrong type a little bit. Ron mentioned that this morning as a type, the tested type and the true type. And I talked about that a little bit in my own experience. Basically, I think that it's the difference between that experience of feeling authentic and feeling like you're an actor that hasn't quite learned his or her part. So if we have time, we'll come back to that a little more. We have some other things we would like to get into, but we'll keep that back as a possible question to speak more about.
Mm-hmm.
Other questions from other sites, Steve?
Let me read one more on the email, if I can find it. It's a intense one. I'll just read it, and I'll leave it up to you whether you want to answer it or not. It's a little involved. At the time the Myers-Briggs was developed, computing power was very weak. The types were therefore defined by dichotomous levels on 4 separate scales. Now, with the advent of desktop advanced statistical analysis, have the Myers-Briggs measures ever been subjected to Q-type factor analysis or cluster analysis to see if the original 16 Myers-Briggs types are found? Also, have the MD measures ever been factor analyzed to see if the 4-factor model holds up? That's beyond my level. Don't know if you all want to comment on that point or not. That's from Frederick in California.
Yeah.
The answer is yes and no, not good enough yet, very briefly. In other words, there has been a good deal of re-looking at this. The Myers-Briggs is a forced choice instrument, and ipsative as a result of that. Ipsative meaning that it's a few answers can push you strongly in one direction rather than the other. That's a little unfortunate part of the MBTI. The Singer-Loomis is essentially the MBTI on how one has developed each function. It's a very different way of looking at this. Instead of being an S or an N, for instance, how S are you or how N are you? That's essentially the Singer-Loomis. And there's the 5-factor model, which is very, I think somewhat unfortunately, quite popular in psychological circles. The 5-factor model looks basically at 4 of these factors, but has preferences for them. And the preference ends up to be an ESFJ. So the 5-factor model would unfortunately suggest that this very typically American model is, or personality type is what one should be. The 5th factor being neurotic. So you're either an ESFJ or you're neurotic. I'm forcing this a little bit, but I mean, so there has been that done. There is now a move in psychology in general towards a dimensional model, not just of personality type, but of all pathology. So instead of saying you are depressed or not depressed, is how depressed are you? Even you're schizophrenic or not schizophrenic, how schizophrenic are you on various dimensions? So it's being looked at, but it hasn't been done very well. I think the general answer to your more elaborate statistical question is probably no. I'm not a statistician very well, so I can't address that specifically. It's as much as I know about it.
Okay. Let me ask one last question, and then we'll turn it back over to keep going with the presentation. Is empathy with a patient synonymous with countertransference?
Yes.
Okay.
That's
good.
my simple S answer. Now, Boris has a couple of paragraphs he'll surely add to that.
Oh, my. I think I'd say you have to be careful. I would echo Ron from earlier saying, notice it. Notice what's going on. And it's, I think of an analogy here that may not be perfect, but if you are, say that you're at your office and you notice outside that it's raining, and it's just information, but you've noticed it, and you don't have any emotional reaction to it, it's kind of a detachment, that there's an observing consciousness, but you can also notice you're feeling empathic. That, I think, would not be countertransference. I think if you find yourself being moved by it, dimensionally speaking, you've got your toe in the water or your foot, or it's up to your ankle or your knee, and there's a chance you're going to be swept away, you have countertransference. But ideally, if you notice it and it's just information, yeah, I would call that not so much countertransference, because it's not tapping then into some old part of yours. But suddenly, if your client looks like your kid brother or your ex-wife, the chances are you get some countertransference going on. Okay. Shall we go on?
Yes.
Okay. What do you want to take?
It would be my suggestion that we try to be as practical about this as we can, because really the title of this type's workshop was how we engage clients or patients, if you will. And what we're bringing to the table, we wanted to at least briefly look at this transference, countertransference, which we think is basic to that. So really, in this last, we have about 45 minutes here. We would want to do the best to present some of our ideas and probably even more than that, hear from you questions that you have about yourself and or the clients that you have, and how we might utilize our understanding of our own type, perhaps our dominant functions, our auxiliary functions, and how that might operate. That would be my preference that we do that.
That's good.
Okay.
Actually, South Bend had asked for a case study. I wonder if we could do some vignettes out of our own experience here, safely. That I could start off with one. I'm thinking of a client who, as you know, Jungians will work a lot with dreams. If the client brings dreams, and we'll try to get dreams brought. But I'm thinking of a client who brought lots of dreams and was obviously very moved and very fascinated by them, but could not, so far as I could tell, move beyond the recitation of the fascinating dream. And I was trying, I realized, to unpack the meaning in the dream. So there was, it dawned on me that there's a clear typological difference here, that I'm wanting to see the possibilities in the imagery and in the sequence of images. And the client is pretty much, I would have to say, stuck at the level of the text of the report on the dream. So I've probably been discovered as having a liking for intuition, would you say?
Yes.
Yes.
Moderately.
All right. So my problem with this client, we were both stuck. It wasn't just he was stuck in the dream. I was stuck in wanting to unpack it. And what would be the intermediate ground? How would it be possible for me to help the client open up the dream and make the information more useful? I did not have a good answer to that. I do not have a good answer to that, but there you have the clinical situation where a difference in type is just so pronounced that we couldn't get anywhere at the time. Now, if others have ideas on that, you know, I'm all ears for that.
No. Let's give 2 or 3 vignettes, and
Yes,
then we'll open
excellent.
it up, and we'll have your vignettes as well as ours. Let me tell you about, you know who this is, but this is a patient of mine. I'll call him Jim. And Jim, I have seen, are you ready for this? For 25 years. 25 years. Off and on a little bit. I didn't see him for a year, and then I didn't see him for another year, and he moved out of town, moved back, moved to different towns, but at any rate, he is on the Myers-Briggs an ENFP, extroverted, very intuitive feeling, if you will, and a very low boundary P person. ENFP people, by and large, my experience is that they are very attractive. They're fun-loving, they're engaging, and they are sort of love 'em and leave 'em people. Not that that's the whole of what, I don't mean to put him in a box, but what happened over time with Jim is that I was intrigued by him. A lot of countertransference that I really wasn't aware of at the time. Huge amount of transference with me because he had very little objectivity in his life. Extreme NF, and I'm a relatively extreme ST, so that operation operated for a lot of both first very positively and then very negatively liked me a lot and didn't like me a lot. Over time with Jim, the lack of Jim is also borderline, as you might have guessed by the number of years that I've been with him, and that may be more than the ENFP profile. But at any rate, just on that nature, borderline personality disorder. Yeah, or I would prefer to call it borderline constellation, but that's just another terminology. Jim would look for what I called an aha, and I would love to give him ahas, and I'd be disappointed if he didn't have another aha. But Jim would come back week after week, and now at the very end of therapy, he is still, I would dare say he has finally got beyond the aha nature, but it took many, many years and probably the approaching termination of therapy for him to actually get beyond just the ahas. So here's, for me, an example of somebody who loved therapy, as, by the way, borderlines tend to do, and a person who loved ideas, which intuitive people love to do, but is anathema at actually doing something. Now, check this out. Jim's occupation is, he is an actuary. Now, those of you who are not familiar with the insurance business might not know that an actuary is basically an ISTJ profession. That's introverted, doing, producing, thinking, concluding. And not surprisingly, he's been in and out of that profession, in and out of several other professions, and so on. But I think an example of a lot of what we've talked about here, his nature, my nature, the transference, the countertransference, the undue extension of therapy. Not that I think 25 years of therapy is awful. It isn't necessarily awful. It's just that there were many times of getting lost in the ideation. And for me to run with Jim on the ideation was fun for him. And for me to slowly move him to any kind of concrete reality, extremely difficult for him. So that would be my person that I bring to the table. Before we go elsewhere, anybody here in Chicago that has had somebody that you can look at that's an interaction between you and your client, similar or dissimilar, that relates to the typology that we've talked about?
Yes. Trying to put in words here. Well, I became aware with this one client itself for 3 years I started to share too much personal information with her. Now, it was kind of like a form of self-disclosure, but it was too much. Try to validate that her experience wasn't that uncommon necessarily, and she had cerebral palsy, and a lot of issues that I went through in childhood were very similar. Okay, the supervision team I was on had stopped for like a year for illness, all kinds of reasons. So I didn't have that feedback I was used to getting. And finally, when I got back into that, this was identified. And then when and her Myers-Briggs was very similar to mine. So we'd have really kind of neat sessions sometimes. And then I realized I wasn't helping her see her ENFT. I'm not getting that in a conscious way where she could examine what she was internalizing or whatever. And finally started to do that more effectively. She got very mad at me, very angry at me, and then we could get moving. See if we could get moving after that. And she eventually went on, did get her master's degree, and there was still some countertransference going on, but I passed on going to the ceremony. Those kind of issues, and said, we agreed that she accomplished her goals with me. But it was really missed it for about a year and a half.
Did you hear that, Ashlyn?
Yes, we sure could. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else here in Chicago?
Who else were then? Steve?
Let's ask any other comments or cases people would like to present. I'll just open it up to any of the sites, any of the 5 group sites or Asheville. Speak up and we'll give you the floor. Sorry, wait, is somebody back there?
Will we be covering typing?
I have a question.
Hold on one second. Asheville has a question. Who was?
Will we be covering typing counseling?
Will we be covering type and counseling is a question from somebody here in Asheville. And sir, did you mean something in particular? It's on the sheet. Okay, he was just looking at the outline and wondering where that piece would be in the outline. We'll turn it back over to you, Chicago.
Actually, I thought I heard a question from South Bend. Is that right?
Yes.
Go ahead, South Bend.
I'm curious, when, for example, taking this on a larger scale, when the patient is United States, for example, is there any work being done on an international level with typology? Is this being applied at the UN or so forth to understand the differences in between larger groups?
Oh yes, there's a great deal of that going on. APT in particular has groups in all 6 continents and as many as 80 different countries. So there's a great deal of that going on. It's used in business far more than it's used in psychology, unfortunately. I'm a psychologist. I will dare tell you that the psychologists that I know are either not fluent with it or they use the 5-factor model, which I think is helpful, but again, I think pejorative. And there have been many people that have admitted to or acknowledged their personality types, not the least of which have been recent presidents and presidential aspirants. President Clinton took the instrument, and he is, anybody have a guess what President Clinton was? Extroverted, yes. Close, NF. And the last, P. So President Clinton was an ENFP. His wife, by the way, Clinton, Hillary Clinton, INTJ. President Bush, the second one. IS, close, TP. ISTP. And if you look at those presidential people, you can see some of those phenomena operating, both strengths and weaknesses. So there has been a lot of international work done and some of that practical, but we're a long way from, I think, utilizing this and integrating the Myers-Briggs kind of absolutist element with the more depth Jungian perspective.
Hurt people, like people know they can go for that Achilles. You know, that kind of works that way. Like in relationships, you reveal yourself and then like, oh, I'm going to use that later to get back to you.
A question here in Chicago, or a comment really was, it's possible to know one's strengths or weaknesses and use that as a weapon, or you feel it as an Achilles heel. Certainly so.
Well, I had a comment about Boris's case. I recall having a patient like that, a patient where, you couldn't seem to get them to work on interpreting their dream. They would present them, but couldn't seem to go further. So, I'm just wondering, listening to you speak about that, whether then one approaches it from one of the auxiliary functions, like the feeling function, for example. Maybe that's, what you can do with the dream. I'm just wondering about that.
Actually, good question, Judith. I did attempt to work different ways. This person was very fond of what he called amplification. So he would bring a lot of what was there was book knowledge. What was not there was personal association, personal relevance. And so I got the impression that either the relating to himself was something that was either very difficult or very dangerous. And it's still an unresolved situation, but it's a good comment, good questions.
Well, let me speak a little bit to somebody in Nashville asked about a couple of pages here using typing counseling. I tell you what, I said before that I'll send this out to you so you can have all the blanks filled in. I can fill them in now, but I think more relevant, let me just summarize some of what I'd like to say here. Essentially, what I would present is that you need to know your own type, and then you need to know the type of the client that you're being with. I would augment that to say that is not all of what a client is. It's not just one's personality type. And when I do a diagnostic assessment of somebody, I have a page of diagnostic impression, and those of us who are therapists know that for insurance companies we have to fill in 5 axes. Well, before I do that, I have diagnostic impression personality diagnosis, which is the 4 functions and then, or the 4 dimensions, and then maybe a summary. And then an intellectual diagnosis, which is what's one's intelligence, linguistic or musical or artistic, and then pathology. So there's a whole lot more here than just typing. Secondly, while I use a lot of other instruments in this, I'd like to suggest here that how do we deal with type if it is extreme? I think some of what we had, both the Jim that I talked about and your patient, among other things, extreme intuitives. And do we forcefully sort of try to push the person beyond that extreme, a deeply feeling person who feels all the time and looking for feeling, or a thinking person who is always analyzing, or these other kinds? It's a very, very relevant question. So I have some thoughts about that, or maybe you do. So let me share briefly my thoughts and then hear from Boris. And I do want to hear from you because this is very germane to ours. If we're going to actually use typology in counseling, how do we deal with at least this phenomenon of extremes? So a couple comments, and I'll leave it to Boris. First, I think you have to recognize what this is. You have to recognize that this is a strength first with the person. Anything other than strength first, you're going to try to fix the person. Doesn't matter what that person is. Nobody wants to be fixed. So there has to be an affirmation of that. So I think the Myers-Briggs or something similar is very helpful, even if you don't use the instrument to affirm somebody, say, being a feeling-based person. And I find that very important. Perhaps that function more than anything in my work with people is to affirm that feeling-based function. Like I said before, you just feel, you just know. This is a good way of intuiting. You feel it. You feel that you have a sense of what's operating here. That is not the intuitive function, that is the feeling function. You make a judgment, but you make it on a subjective basis. And it is ultimately rational. It doesn't look rational. So, I mean, that's, for me, very, very important to just acknowledge what's there. Secondly, when you see an extreme function, you are seeing pathology. You are seeing a strength, but you are seeing pathology. So, when I have somebody finishes the MBTI, and they have 25S and 0N, or 25F and 0T, I know 2 things. I know, well, 3 things. I know, first, this person has a tremendous gift. Secondly, this person is defensive for reasons that I don't understand, but that are good reasons. He has been in an environment that is antagonistic to who he is. And thirdly, he is not about to be moved off that. He has to add to that dimension. So my thought with extremes is that they're always pathological, but you can't start there. So at least, Boris, those are some of my thoughts about it.
Yes. I've learned from Ron a very good word, and the word is and, A-N-D. Yeah, it's a good word. And picking up on what Ron was saying, actually it fits with what I was going to say anyway, which is nice. We have to join where the client is, at least for a starter. We have to establish enough rapport that the client feels safe without being safe and less defensive, less defended. defended and defensive, and maybe a subtle difference, but in any case, so the client relaxes and begins to open up. And that only happens, I think, if the client, just like you and me, if we feel the other person is open to us or can tune in to us, okay, I can show a little more of myself. Now here's the gift from Ron, and the gift is A and D. You are very intuitive, and what do we move to from there? Do we move to the sensation? Do we move to the thinking? Okay, or do we move rather to the feeling or the thinking? You're very intuitive, and what effect does this have on you? Or you're very intuitive, and how does this fit into the bigger picture as you see the bigger picture? You see, you could go either way from that great gift. But the greater the gift, the smaller the A and D is going to be. But it's that adding to on the basis of having made a connection, having developed some rapport, some mutual comfort, I guess I would have to say. Mutual comfort, because if you aren't comfortable, you can be pretty sure the client is not comfortable. Yeah. Right. The other thing I would say, affirming what Ron has said, we are the instrument. We are the healing instrument. It's not our knowledge. That's useful and it's important, but there's plenty of knowledge that our people have read in self-help books and they're still in a mess. And so it's not the knowledge that makes a difference. It's the delivery system, you and me. Or if it's not in a therapeutic relationship, if it's a social relationship, it doesn't have to be therapeutic. If it's a social relationship, if it's a business relationship, if it's in the office that has nothing to do with psychology, it can be engineering, it can be finance, it can be whatever. Awareness of one's own typological preferences and strengths and, dare we say, weaknesses, less fully developed abilities, and a sense of the people around us, getting some hypothesis about how they operate typologically is useful, because then we can better understand or believe we can, or at least we have a start and better understand. So since I lost where I was going, let's see if I can get back there. We are the instrument. We're the delivery system as therapists, or as employers, or as colleagues, or as, you can fill out the list. Parents. We have to calibrate ourselves. An instrument that is not calibrated is no good. You can have a thermometer, but if there's no markings on the scale, all you have is a tube of colored liquid or mercury, and you don't know what it means. And so those markings in the sense of psychological type, the markings are our attitude, our preferred attitude, and then our dominant and auxiliary functions. That's calibration. That's one of the ways of calibration. Of course, there are lots of other ways of calibrating that are important too. So getting that is going to make us basically better able to deal with what happens around us and to deal with what happens in us. Adaptation, the big A word.
I'd like to talk about the phenomenon of affect, which we've covered several times here, and particularly affect of the therapist with the patient. So I would suggest that on these four functions predominantly, we could look at the other two attitudes as well, but on the four functions, you will likely have affect. And I think of the many affects that are important, we've addressed liking and disliking. I would like to suggest that we really attend to boredom. I think boredom is a very, very important phenomenon. Should not be neglected, should not be pathologized, should not be something that we need to get over. You need to recognize if you're bored with your patient, and then examine that from the perspective of what we have looked at. The transference that might be happening, the countertransference that might be happening, this person's an S, you're an N, this person is extroverted, you're introverted, whatever. But to recognize it, my experience with the boredom phenomenon is that it's artificial. In way, I think boredom is not being honest in some fashion or another. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily being open. You can be honest, but not necessarily open. You can know, oh, I'm bored. And that recognition will, I think, change the direction. You will say something, you will not say something, you will reflect, you might engage, but just acknowledging I'm bored means that you have lost the patient in some way or another. And it is your fault. It is not her fault. It is not wrong. It is not something to be chastised, but definitely something to be recognized. And that's just one of many affects. The liking, the disliking is very important, the excited, the running with. There are many, many positive sorts of things, but boredom for me, anger is secondarily, but boredom, I think, is something that can really slither by and think, well, this will pass. Not good enough therapy. Comment on that or not?
I would simply affirm that. I couldn't add anything. Couldn't have said it better.
Okay.
Couldn't have said it better.
I would like to address what I think is one of the latter pages here, type and psychopathology, but would it be valuable to have any other comments or questions from this or other sites? I'll give you just a moment to respond. No? Go on.
One of the places where that challenges me is I do group therapy, and having people with different type in the same group is very challenging. Both to get out, to respond to, I don't know how to say it more, but anyway, some people are extroverted, some people are very sensate, some people are intuitive, and to sort of facilitate that in a group setting. It's helpful to sort of recognize what people have, and then sometimes when I don't know what they have, and sort of force myself to be maybe more of a J or more of an extrovert to sort of meet the needs of the group is something challenge that I struggle with.
Could you hear that in Asheville?
Yes, came across well.
Good. A very relevant question. Let me address it briefly, and then maybe Boris. First, thank you very much, because when we talk about a group situation, we have, as you well know, tremendous opportunity, because we have in a group, frankly, in my mind, something closer to reality that we do in individual therapy. Not that I don't love individual therapy, I do, but what you have there, the reason that's so challenging is that's real life. You have somebody that is talking too much, you have somebody that's not talking enough, you have somebody who's very concrete and seemingly boring, you have somebody that's abstract and goes on forever. So first, just an affirmation that that's tough and it's good just to be there. I think there are some exercises that can be done that actually utilizes these phenomena. One of the things that I've done in a group setting is being able to say, now, if you're in a group setting in some way or another, I would like everybody to stand up and now find a place that's comfortable for you to sit down again. And what I'm looking for there is the introverted and the extroverted phenomenon. What you will have generally is the extroverted people, especially extroverted feeling people, will sit down next to somebody and close to somebody, where the introverted person will find a corner generally away from some, and it leads to good discussion about those two phenomena that operate and the value of that. It's good for the introvert to find a corner to talk to one person. It's good for the extrovert to be in a group of large people. And there are a number of other sort of exercises that you can frame from those four different dimensions that I think utilizes that.
Maybe I can email you about those.
You can.
Thank you. Okay, thank you.
If we don't have other comments, let me ask you to, and I certainly can be interrupted here, but let me skip a couple of pages and go to what you should be entitled Type and Psychopathology.
Page 24.
Thank you very much. Page 24. And then we're going to look at possible type correlations with these. These would be generally the larger categories that we look for in pathology diagnosis. The first is mood disorders, depression, anxiety, and bipolar disorder, although frankly bipolar disorder can be elsewhere as well. So we have mood disorders. Secondly, addictive disorders. They are some kind of substance, something ingested, which of course includes food, or behavioral disorders, which might be some kind of promiscuity or playing all the time, working all the time. An addictive disorder, by the way, is a habit that has got beyond value and it takes away from the rest of life, very simply defined. Thirdly, my preference would be the word character disorder. That's an older term. These days it's referred to as personality disorder. And so character or personality preferred disorder. And narcissism is the key element of this, which narcissism in the simplest form is selfishness, but much more importantly, narcissism is the lack of self, really. Generally, people with this kind of disorder have had a history of indulgence, very often following a history of neglect. You understand here I'm giving you another graduate level course in psychopathology in one page, but and as I said a moment ago, lack of self-development and usually excesses and extremes. Fourthly, thought disorders. This is fragmentation of personality. This is predominantly schizophrenic disorders. This also actually can be bipolar disorders, can be some major depressive disorders, but predominantly we have, among other A's, auditory hallucination and blues association and a variety of others, which we can get to another time. But anyway, thought disorders. And then finally, situational disorders, and that would be marital, interpersonal, occupational, academic, living situation, physical health. So again, mood disorders, addictive disorders, character disorders, thought disorders, and situational disorders. Now, let me tell you what I know about the data that's out there about correlations. We do know these correlations, and maybe we'll look at 2 or 3 of them. There is distinctly a correlation between introversion and depression. Without saying more about that, how does that make sense?
Introverts might lack social encounters, they might be isolated, withdrawn, and that could lead to some depression.
We're an extroverted society.
Yes.
They don't fit in.
A little louder so they can hear.
We're an extroverted society. You know, introverts are
Yes.
not the norm or acceptable.
We're an extroverted society, or the other comment, introverted, withdrawn, withdrawn. Any other comments from Asheville or elsewhere on this? This is an extremely important way of looking at this. I want to say that because, you know, there should be a kind of a knee-jerk reaction from the introverts in the crowd here. It's like, no, wait a minute, you're saying that I'm depressed, and I hope you do have that sort of, no, wait a minute, that's not there. I'm just talking statistically, introverts are more inclined towards depression.
Well, you can exacerbate your isolation. I mean, you can be an introvert. By not being an extrovert, you can exacerbate your isolation by not reaching out. So I can see easily how you choose not to reach out, you're afraid to reach out, and you know, all that sort of stuff. And that make it worse.
Yes.
The other side of it, though, is that in introversion, it is referencing everything to the subject, to oneself. Whereas with extroversion, at least in one sense, the reference is elsewhere, not oneself. And consequently, there is not the self-scrutiny or the noticing, I would presume, typically.
Huh? I didn't notice.
Right, exactly. And that actually then will mask a kind of depression. I've just recently started reading something about depression in men in our society, that many men are actually depressed, although they wouldn't fit the clinical picture because they have taken on the adaptation of the society, which is extroverted, often sensing and thinking, or doing in any case. But there may not be any joy in it, or it may be become more and more forced doing, which is masking, actually, a depression from a failure to pay attention to what's going on in the person, whether the person is actually introverted or extroverted, but that's kind of a long riff on that. But.
By the way, interesting, Boris, that the statistics on depression are these. 9 out of 10, correct that, 8 out of 10 suicides are male.
Yes.
9 out of 10 suicide gestures are female. So women talk about it and threaten it, men do it. So it's very, very relevant topic to just... Okay, so I want to look at a couple other pathologies, but how do we then approach depression
and or introversion if they do correlate, which they do correlate. And how do we distinguish those as different but correlating phenomena? One is depressed, but also introverted. Where do you start with that? And if I dare answer my rhetorical question to start with, all questions are rhetorical anyway, is to say that I think you start with affirming introversion. Affirming it, affirming it, affirming it, affirming it, and then saying and.
I think that's what women do.
Yes.
Culture. And men don't in their culture. It has a lot to do with those statistics.
Yes.
Maybe our culture selects female as intuitive sometimes, and that might translate into my experience.
Yes.
Which I don't know if Young would agree with. I don't think so, but I think there's a lot up in the air about that.
Yes. F will intervene if you need to at any time. We'll go on back and forth here. Let me suggest.
Let me just intervene real quick if I could. It's about 20 minutes. 20 minutes to, and I would like to save a little bit of time to do a quick closing and kind of go around. So that sort of means 5 to 10 more minutes of lecture and then kind of wrap up, if that's okay.
Okay. Let me give a couple of quick things. I mentioned extroverts. Do you have introverts? Did you have any idea what one of the predominant pathologies would be of us extroverts? Looking in front of you here. What are we extroverts inclined towards? Somebody said mania. Somebody said addictive disorders. Borderline. Narcissism. Character disorders. Character disorders. So if we want to look at pathology, we will predominantly see the visible character disorders. By the way, those would be the narcissists. Those would be the hysterics. And those that would be part of one of the clusters on so-called Axis 2 would be more inclined for us extroverts to do. And that makes sense, doesn't it? I mean, if it's an extroverted world, I get in my way, I talk more, I have more stuff, and I'm more pushy, and ultimately my narcissism shows in some way or another. Excluding present company, I hope. Right. So those are two clear elements. Now, so how do you deal with that? I think a very important phenomenon. What about thought disorders? Who might be inclined to, not necessarily a schizophrenic disorder, which may or may not be biological, but how about those people who are truly sort of confused in where they're going in life, uncertain, maybe a bit fragmented?
Intuitive?
Ideas? Anywhere else? We've had SPs? FPs? Somebody said feeling perceivers, FPs. And Tom, you said...
I can see where... I've had 2 cases with chest pain. They're always trying to make sense out of everything, but they're only going to make sense out of one thing, you know. So I think there's a lot of sensing in that sometimes. That's trying to, you know, and block everything else out, oversimplify. And these are very good chest players.
Well, I think the array of answers we have actually answers what the data seems to show, and the thought disorders are all over the place. You can have a person that's deeply feeling and lost in feelings, a person that's very introverted thinking and lost in thoughts, a person that is deeply ideational, a high-end person, and he or she has all sorts of ideas and possibilities and gets lost. And you have the very interesting sort of concrete, down-to-earth, do-it, obsessive-compulsive sensing person. So roughly there. That's as much as I think we should tackle. Please understand this is a very brief assessment of this. We've skipped a number of things.
You'll all have this, for what it's worth, in more exact detail. So over to
I hope that you can see now, by this point in the day, that
Female as intuitive sometimes, and that might translate into my experience.
yes.
Which I don't know if Young would agree with. I don't think so, but I think there's a lot up in the air about that.
Yes. Ash will intervene if you need to at any time. We'll go on back and forth here. Let me suggest.
Let me just intervene real quick if I could. It's about 20 minutes. 20 minutes to, and I would like to save a little bit of time to do a quick closing and kind of go around. So that sort of means 5 to 10 more minutes of lecture and then kind of wrap up, if that's okay.
Okay. Let me give a couple of quick things. I mentioned extroverts. Do you have introverts? Do you have any idea what one of the predominant pathologies would be of us extroverts? Looking in front of you here. What are we extroverts inclined towards? Somebody said mania. Somebody said addictive disorders. Borderline. Narcissism. Character disorders. Character disorders. So if we want to look at pathology, we will predominantly see the visible character disorders. By the way, those would be the narcissists, those would be the hysterics, and those that would be part of one of the clusters on the so-called Axis 2 would be more inclined for us extroverts to do. And that makes sense, doesn't it? I mean, if it's an extroverted world, I get in my way, I talk more, I have more stuff, and I'm more pushy, and ultimately my narcissism shows in some way or another. Excluding present company, I hope. Right. So those are two clear elements. Now, so how do you deal with that? I think a very important phenomenon. What about thought disorders? Who might be inclined to, not necessarily a schizophrenic disorder, which may or may not be biological, but how about those people who are truly sort of confused in where they're going in life, uncertain, maybe a bit fragmented?
Intuitive.
Ideas? Anywhere else? We've had SPs? FPs? Somebody said feeling perceivers, FPs. And Tom, you said...
well, I can see where... I've had 2 cases with chest plates. They were always trying to make sense out of everything, but they're only going to make sense out of one thing, you know. So I think there's a lot of sensing in that sometimes, that trying to, you know, and block everything else out, oversimplify. And these are very good chess players.
Well, I think the array of answers we have actually answers what the data seems to show, and the thought disorders are all over the place. You can have a person that's deeply feeling and lost in feelings, a person that's very introverted thinking and lost in thoughts, a person that is deeply ideational, a high-end person, so forth, and he or she has all sorts of ideas and possibilities and gets lost. And you have the very interesting sort of concrete, down-to-earth, do-it, obsessive-compulsive sensing person, so roughly there. That's as much as I think we should tackle. Please understand this is a very brief assessment of this. We've skipped a number of things. You'll all have this, for what it's worth, in more exact detail. So I'll turn it over to Brother Boris here.
I hope that you can see now, by this point in the day, that this area of psychological type is very valuable, and all the answers are not in yet to everybody's satisfaction. It comes, as Ron and I talk over time, it becomes more and more clear to me that There is yet work to be done on this, as useful as it already is. So at least the question has been well raised with what Jung says, with what Myers-Briggs do, what the other folks do. But as is probably we all know, when there are many remedies prescribed for a given situation, the chance is that nobody has gotten the actual Salk vaccine to take care of it. In closing, then, I would like to just talk about briefly one more thing and refer you actually to the last pages of the Jung on psychological type handout. And one of those is a piece from Jung. I quoted that with the example of the doctor who has to activate the feeling function. But then the piece from the interview with von Franz. And von Franz is also talking about full realization. And you can read it in the handout, but let me just paraphrase one line in there. She's talking about old Joe Smith, all right, in this interview. And she's saying that to realize something is to work it through with each of the functions, with sensation, with thinking, intuition, and feeling. And in her example, a person gets something, say, intuitively. Got it, got the picture. And then, okay, well, what does that mean in terms of the thinking function? How does it fit into the bigger scheme of things? How does typology, for example, fit into psychopathology and into lifelong development? Oh, see, that would be kind of a thinking activity there, to take this little piece, psychological type, and fit it into lifespan development, to fit it into psychopathology, to fit it into genetics eventually. Who knows? That would be involve, of course, the sensation function too. So you could struggle with that for a long time and say, oh, I see how it fits in that bigger piece now. That's great. Do you have it all? No. What are the possibilities? So then you have to struggle through with the possibilities, and finally, well, what does it mean in human terms? If psychological type were genetically modifiable, if it could be modified through genetic manipulation, what would that mean? So there's another question, of values. Anyway, that's the example von Franz uses. So what happens if somebody's worked through something with all four functions and found her native ground or his native ground? Well, a person is able to be more fully real. And as she says in that example, it's still the same old Joe Smith, I recognize him. John Smith analysis in this example has not spoiled him. He's more real. He's more there, more present, more fully authentic. Recognizable as the same person, but there's a greater liveliness, a greater presence, very distinct, but vivid. So I refer you to that and remind you, before I turn it back to Steve, that in my reading of Jung over the last three decades, I have come to notice that he mentions psychological type time and time again. It may just be a word. It may just be an allusion, a reference that is not saying extroversion, introversion, or one of the four functions, but it's there. And it's a central part of analytical psychology that unfortunately often, I think, has ended up a stepchild because it is a work, I would say, not really in progress so much as in fermentation, something like that. All right. Here in Chicago, we've had a good day. Thank you at the remote sites. Steve, thank you for anchoring this for us. People at the remote sites, glad you were with us. Those of you who want continuing education credits will receive an email from the Jung Institute in Chicago. This email will refer you, give you a link to a SurveyMonkey site. If you want your CEs, click on that link, fill out the survey, return it to Chicago, and then, and only then, you get your continuing education unit. So When you get the email from Jesse Marassa at the C.G. Jung Institute of Chicago, click on the link that's included, answer the survey, click to send it back. Your CEs will be forthcoming. Thanks a lot, folks.
Thank you. Yes. We've got a few minutes left. I'd like to just wrap up with the various sites. I really do want to thank both you, Boris, and you, Ron, for such a wonderful job today. We were all juggling numerous things simultaneously, not too many balls dropped, and again, thank you, for your fine presentation. A couple things to close, then I'll be asking the sites to just give a closing comment if they'd like to, so you can be thinking about that, the 5 sites. I do want to apologize for unanswered questions. There were quite a few of email questions to us from cyberspace. I tried to answer as many of those as possible or get them out to the presenters. But again, thank you for your participation from the distant sites. That was quite helpful. Do email us any comments you'd like. You have our email address, ashevilleyoungcenter@charter.net. It's on the various things you've already gotten. And if anybody would be willing to send us comments on what was good, what wasn't good, what you liked, what you didn't like, future requests, we will be reading those closely. I may even send out an email requesting that to people if that's okay. Just to remind you briefly, again, there's 2 future events on the books. August 7th, Active Imagination. That will be through MAHAC and UNCA and some of these other sites. That will be with Paul Brochet, live out of Zurich with Murray Stein as well. And November 7th is the theater piece of the Jung and Victor White relationship, followed by a live discussion. There will also be, hopefully, a DVD made of today's presentation, and as soon as we get the tape reasonably edited and available, we'll send out an email to everybody, and that will be posted on the websites also. So I would like to go around in closing to the various sites. New York, we'll start with you. Before we do, though, Charlotte, if you can be typing out an email to me, and if you can get it to me in 2 minutes, I'll read that email comment. And if you're too introverted to have a comment, that is fine as well. But I will scan my email in a moment. So in the meantime, New York City, any closing remarks that you'd like to offer today?
Certainly the complexity of the human being is written about by Jung in so many ways, but elaborated upon in the typology theory. It was very, very interesting, and the handouts, the readings, and the discussion were terrific. Thanks so much, Steve, Ron, and Boris.
I actually have a comment, too. It was wonderful, and I feel like it's just the beginning. One thing I wish we could have spent more time on is how inferior functions manifest themselves.
Yes, well, thank you, New York City. It was such a delight to have you with us today. And we've got some kinks that are mostly worked out, and hope that we can keep going with you with this. Well, good. South Bend, Indiana, any closing comments or remarks?
Well, we here in South Bend would like to also thank Boris and Ron for the presentation and their energy. No other comments, and we look forward to being a part of many more such presentations. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. Greatly appreciated your presence as well. Flat Rock, North Carolina, any closing comments?
Hey, Steve, Ron and Boris, we want to just say we really appreciated the work you put into this and how interesting it was for us. We'd love to participate more in understanding more about personality type and the psychopathologies and inferior functions as well. And of course, Steve, we'll look forward to participating in the future. Thanks, Steve.
Excellent. Thank you. Omaha, any closing comments? Okay. And Charlotte, I've got a brief email, says, thank you, well done, we all thought so. And thank you from Louisville as well, and some of the other email folks. So again, that concludes today's seminar. Please do let us know what we can do in the future to support Actually, before we do, I haven't asked Asheville, which is more than just me. Asheville comments, anything Asheville would like to add to today? Everybody's tired, I know. Just nice, pleasant nods. Okay, good. Well, again, thanks everybody, and we'll see people later. Bye-bye.